Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Sunday. Welcome to the latest Loki video. This time we're going to look at his relationship with his wife, Sigyn. Now there's scanty information, as per usual, and beyond the mention that Sigyn was one of the Aesir, what we know about her mostly has to do with the story about the binding of Loki. Now in this episode, one of Sigyn's sons was transformed into a wolf, driven mad, killed her other son, and then his entrails were used to bind Loki to a rock, and then there was this serpent dripping venom onto Loki's face. Sigyn stayed in this scene of horror, held a bowl over Loki's head to spare him the worst of this. And while in that cave, she got to see her child's guts used as ropes, and her other child in the form of a wolf, and deprived of his power of reason, and her husband in absolute agony. And essentially, this is the sum total of what mythology has to tell us about the marriage of Loki and Sigyn. Not a whole lot to work with here, I'll be honest. So in meditations and in dream work, whenever I've asked Loki about Sigyn, he's never shared anything personal or that I could really point to. But what sticks in my mind is the emotion that he conveys. There's this overpowering sense of love and devotion and respect. And for all that Loki is painted as being extremely promiscuous, I just have to wonder about that. You know, for one, we don't know what affairs took place, at what period of time, or how long those things went on, and whether or not there was overlap in between his liaisons. And for two, so far as I can tell, it's not clear, at least not to me, if any of these affairs took place after his marriage to Sigyn. You know, I'm not trying to make a sweeping statement about Loki's sexual partners, past or present. It's really none of my business, and probably the answer to some of those questions would frighten me. So I do not ask about that. But considering just his energy whenever I've asked about Sigyn, I do honestly believe that his bond with her is so profound, so sincere, and so all-consuming that I would be very surprised if I was presented just absolute proof positive that Loki wasn't faithful to her. I could be wrong. I'm not making, sweeping claims. I'm just saying I would be extremely surprised. Now, the thing about Loki is that he is this unstoppable force, but I've always seen Sigyn as being the immovable object. And instead of annihilating each other, as often happens on occasions when you have these opposing forces where one person can't be stopped and the other person can't be moved, and then they collide, what happened in the case of Loki and Sigyn, and at least this is the impression I keep getting, is that they have balanced each other. And I don't want to say that they curb each other's more extreme traits. That doesn't feel quite right to say. But I have a sense of wholeness. They provide wholeness for each other, and it's enduring. Now, the myth about the binding of Loki, it's very difficult to discern what may have been literal and how much is symbolic and what was exaggerated or altered to suit the purpose of the people who wrote the myths. Pardon me. But the thing about it is that Loki seems content to just let me contemplate the stories as we have received them. In meditations, the most guidance I've gotten from him is that he seems to not want me to worry so much about what may have been literal and just concentrate more on what the stories can teach. So what little we know about Loki and Sigyn's relationship, I think it does teach several things. The first is that Sigyn's willingness to take care of Loki at his absolute lowest point, while she is herself coping with the despair of the situation, the destruction of her children, and all the pain she must have felt, if she's willing to go through that, this tells me that their relationship has real substance. You know, Sigyn really doesn't have an ill word written about her in the lore. No one seems to think badly of her. And because of her conduct in this story, it does seem that she truly values Loki, and that must mean that he is more than what his detractors say that he is. In fact, her devotion to Loki was a key factor when I was deliberating whether or not to voluntarily work with him. I don't think that any woman or goddess would stick by a man or a god under such severe circumstances if she had the freedom to leave, which apparently she did. But she wouldn't do that if he wasn't worth loving and worth that kind of sacrifice. Now, the second lesson that I can see is that a wild heart such as Loki and a very steadfast heart such as Sigyn are not inherently incompatible or even all that different from each other. I think both states of being involve a great deal of passion, and that requires fuel and being active and involved and committed. It's about being whole-souled in what you're doing and being fully committed to who you're with. This is just my intuition talking, but the feeling I have about their relationship is that it's always in the present tense. I don't see them wallowing in the past. I don't see them worrying too much about the future. I mean, Loki always seems to be planning, but he's not worried about the future. He's thinking about the steps he can take in all of these various eventualities. And when it comes to him and Sigyn, it just seems like they're in the here and now. They're operating as a team, and I'm thinking that this is a pattern of behavior for them. Now, the third lesson of this story has to do with Sigyn's name and her titles. Her name is roughly translated as Victorious Girlfriend, and one of her titles makes a reference as her having the magical power over fetters, chains, bindings. Often her associations with the idea of victory are viewed through the lens of her capacity to endure. However, since one of her titles has to do with bindings, I think one reasonable interpretation is that she would have the magical ability to break bindings. And maybe her name meaning victory, that isn't a reference to her capacity for endurance, but it's a victory in the sense that she was able to free Loki. Now, the lore tells us that when Loki was bound, he was going to remain bound until he broke free just before Ragnarok and then kablooey. However, that literal absolutist interpretation has never sat comfortably with me. And one of the reasons for that is because the story was written down by a Christian monk. And this was the same Christian monk who turned Loki into a satanic-like figure. And in Christian theology, which is discussed in detail in the book of Revelation, there's a war that's called Armageddon, after which Satan and the demons, they're bound into an abyss for 1,000 years, and then after that time they'll be set loose, wreak some havoc. There'll be one last big battle between God and the devil, and after which the devil and all his various minions are destroyed in a lake of fire, and that will be called the second death. And apparently after that point, all wickedness is destroyed forever, and it's all peaches and cream. Now, the comparisons between Loki's binding in the cave and Satan being tossed into an abyss, and between Ragnarok and Armageddon, I mean, these are not perfectly consistent comparisons, but there are enough similarities for me to wonder if Snorri was inserting his Christian perspective. Maybe. It just leaves me with an open mind that the tale that was told in pre-Christian times about what led to the binding itself, and everything that may have happened after that, I'm just thinking there may have been a different nuance to it. And particularly when you realize that some of the older tales of Balder imply that he was eventually raised, and that this was a cyclical death and being raised, much like what the god Lu experiences, or with the Oak King and the Holly King, or with the god in Wicca. He exists for a time, he dies, and then he's reborn at Yule, and then it all keeps going. Just wondering. I don't think that's such a far-off, wild idea. Now, personally, I do believe, let's say that the binding was done in the most literal fashion we could possibly imagine. Well, I think that it's highly probable that Loki has long since escaped those bonds, and I strongly suspect the reason he was able to escape is thanks to his wife. And I don't think that this escape triggered Ragnarok or anything of that kind. I know a scare tactic when I see it, and the way it's written and the way it's conveyed and the way you cannot question any aspect of it, that does seem very much in the realm of outright scare tactics. So I'm left with a personal conclusion. You, of course, can draw your own ideas, but in my personal opinion, I think Snorri repurposed the entire concept of Ragnarok to serve the purpose of making it sound more similar to the Christian Armageddon and its associated theology, as one of those efforts to make the conversion efforts not only easier, but to be more permanent and more long-lasting until such time as people forgot about the gods altogether. It just seems like it's very much in the same kind of cycle that we see played out whenever Christianity took over an area. Just saying. I'd also like to point out at this stage that Loki's and Sigyn's children, Vali and it's the other child was either called Narfi or Narvi, before they were brutally destroyed, and of course, in the case of Narvi, that was absolute destruction, and poor Vali was stuck as a wolf. But before that happened, there's every indication that they were perfectly normal children, the kind of children that any member of the Aesir might have had. Neither had any associations with destruction or with Ragnarok or any traits that were commented upon that were even remotely worrying to anyone. Now, if the way children are raised and how they turn out are reflections of the way that they were parented, as is often the case, not always, but often, then I think that speaks to the quality of family life in Loki and Sigyn's home. I think they must have been doing something right, that there was a workable dynamic and that their sons benefited from that. But given the fragmentary nature of the lore that we've inherited, it's very difficult to piece things together. And it doesn't take long before we're reduced to discussing what can be inferred and what nudges the gods have given us, as we've done in this video. That's not exactly the kind of effort that would make it inside a courtroom or would be accepted in an academic setting. But the value in contemplating mythology, it's not about here's the absolute truth of it. It's more so that it stimulates our thinking process and it gets us to examine things from every single angle. Now, one thing I try to do when I read the stories is try to put myself in the position of every deity in that tale, and every human being, every, monster. What did the situation look like to that god or goddess? What was their stake in what was happening? What outcome would they have wanted? And that's how I approach Sigyn's role in this story. In one fell swoop, she saw one child turned into a wolf, another torn to shreds, her husband tied to a rock with the innards of the dead child, and that nasty snake dripping poison on him. That's a lot of trauma to absorb all in one moment, and to hold yourself together and think about what you can do to actively help the situation. I mean, it's just unimaginable. It goes beyond anything that I think most of us would be even remotely capable of absorbing. But once that happened, what can we reasonably suppose that Sigyn would want at that point? I would think the release of her husband, her surviving child turned back into human form, and ideally her dead child brought back. Now, the surviving lore doesn't comment on the details, but when I think of the story from Sigyn's point of view, I do feel in my soul that where things were left in the story at the cave wasn't the end of the matter, and we definitely don't have the whole story of what was going on. So, make of that what you will. I realize this is a very opinion-driven video, but I suppose that's part of the process of, it's not just being able to be able to parrot back, the substance of any of our myths. It's about, well, this is where my thoughts took me. This is what I'm thinking about. And I got to thinking about this principle, and I thought, does that principle apply in my own life? It's about how we dig into the myths and how that can inform and enrich our practices. That's where the real value comes in. And arguments about what's literal, what's figurative, what happened, what didn't, who, all that. I think that is of a secondary concern because it is the lessons that are taught that we can absorb that's going to do us the most good in our spirituality. So that's what I have to say about Loki this week. Hope you enjoyed it. I would love to hear your reactions and your thoughts, particularly if you are also someone who has worked with Loki over time. I think that could be a really interesting discussion that we could get into. So if you'd like to do that, please visit me at Blackbird's Brew on Discord. There's a link to join in the description box below. And of course, subscribe, like this video, leave me a comment. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.